Could be in any of these
Sure. It could
slices
be
of the pie.
It could be delta salinity control. Again, it's a question of priorities. If you say that it's used for the least high priority activity, then that's the one that it would end up in, because it's the last chunk of water in the system. But I don't want to I was just trying to make the point that the 400,000 is somewhere in the consumptive use category in the system.
Well, I think what's interesting here is just that it's different than what, and I found this in the salinity control issue in particular, where people don't see the salinity control as being as big a deal as it is. And if we lose salinity control, then it's not good for anyone in the Delta or for export. And so that's, I think, at least for me, was pretty much a driving force last year in a lot of what we did.
Okay, so we've received a drought contingency plan. The project submitted it on January 15th as required by the board's TCP order from last fall. The purpose of the drought contingency plan was to identify and provide the rationale for future project operations this water year if the drought continues. The plan we got in January identified most of the changes in the TCP that was submitted subsequently, with the exception of the intermediate pumping level that is the issue that's largely in dispute at this point. So we did get into a TCP request on January 23rd. It asked to amend the conditions of Decision 1641, and it requested amendments for the gate operations, San Joaquin River flows, Delta outflows, export limits, and also said there would be potential future requests. So what are I required to do when I get a temporary urgency change petition? I need to make 4 findings. First, there's an urgent need for the proposed change, and of course that's a comparatively simple finding. The drought constitutes the urgent need. There's no injury to other lawful users of water, and generally we believe that amending these fish and wildlife standards that are proposed have no effect on lawful users of water. No changes have been requested, at least to date, to not meet objectives designed to protect agricultural and municipal supply. So that was a relatively straightforward finding, in my opinion, as well. No unreasonable effect on fish and wildlife, and this finding is the difficult one to make in many circumstances. Determination of what's unreasonable is a judgment call, and in biological systems it's often not possible to quantify the benefit or harm of a particular action. In this case, there are 2 general areas to be looked at: the upstream temperature control and the effects on estuarine resources. With respect to temperature control, we have some well-defined thresholds that we use, and so we can tell whether or not or have pretty good control as to whether or not we're protecting the use. And as you recall, last year there was a problem in that regard. Estuarine resources, on the other hand, are affected by multiple factors, and of which flow and exports are only 2 of the many factors. So we don't have any bright thresholds for these 2 factors. The board, in its previous proceedings on delta flows, established flows that were intended to provide reasonable protection to aquatic resources. And the proposed changes, when implemented, would reduce those numbers substantially and will negatively affect estuarine and migratory species. Determining whether these impacts are unreasonable in this drought condition, taking into consideration the benefits of the changes, requires the exercise of discretion, both at first instance with mine and now subsequently with the board members. The last thing I have to do is make a finding of that the proposed change is in the public interest, and this finding is what people often refer to as rebalancing. So when the board adopted and implemented the existing outflow and export restrictions, the board at that time knew there'd be substantial water supply impacts to implementing those standards. The average critical year impact in D1641 was identified as about 800,000 acre feet, and in many critically dry years it would be over 1 million acre feet. And that's in comparison to the previous set of standards, not in comparison to what people want or what people have in their contracts. And this level of impact was much larger in dry years than in the wetter years. The rationale of what was happening was that the board perceived that you know, that it was the low, very low flows in dry years that were driving a lot of the estuarine impacts, and therefore the standards were designed to have higher impacts in the very low flow conditions. So in any event, it's important to keep all the requests we have to amend D1641 in context. D1641 and the 1995 Bay Delta Plan and the principles agreement upon which all of those things are based were developed following more than 80 days of evidentiary hearings. The requirements cover all water year types, and it includes flexibility for drought year scenarios already. Many parties challenged D1641, but its provisions were all upheld by the courts. And these requirements were designed to be enduring, and so, you know, if we're going to make changes, they have to be carefully considered, obviously. In January of last year, the extremely dry conditions and unusual hydrologic patterns created a situation that fell outside the dry year conditions modeled and contemplated for D1641, and we believe there was an urgent need for action. Conditions remain bleak this year, obviously, but they are different and they affect different regions of the state differently. So let me go over what was requested quickly as I can and what I did. First, there was Delta cross-channel gate operation was asked to be amended. Opening the gates allows water to flow from the Sacramento River into the Central Delta, and this action improves salinity conditions in the Central Delta and the export pumps and allows for overall salinity control in the Delta to be maintained with less fresh water. Unfortunately, opening the gates also provides a conduit for migrating anadromous fish to move from the Sacramento River into the Central Delta, where higher mortality occurs. And the late winter and spring is a critical period for this movement, and so D1641 requires that these gates be completely closed in February and March. The proposal that was submitted by the projects was to go to real-time operation to when the monitoring indicated fish were present, the gates would be closed, and when it appeared as though there might not be fish present and there was a need to maintain salinity control, the gates could be opened. This proposed real-time operation was approved. It seemed like it made a lot of sense, but it also increases the risk. The monitoring is obviously not perfect and you know, when the gates are open, there is the opportunity for some salmon anyway to get into the Central Delta where their survival will be impaired. The second request was for a reduction in San Joaquin River flows. The flow standards on the San Joaquin River are designed to support overall estuarine conditions by providing inflow to southern delta, and the flows also support migratory conditions for salmon and steelhead. Reservoirs in the San Joaquin River watershed have a greater capacity to store water than in the Sacramento River. The percentage of the watershed of the water available that can be captured is greater in the San Joaquin watershed. So it's important that this second largest tributary to the Delta provide reasonable inflows during critical spring period. D1641 requires either 710 or 1,140 CFS, depending on where the X2 position is. And in this case, for February, the requirement was only 1 day of X2. That's been met, by the way, and all that is the X2 has been met. The San Joaquin River flows has not been met, but I'll get to that in a minute. So anyway, the request is that the flows be reduced to 500 CFS. And given I approved this given the very low conditions, storage conditions on New Melones, but I also believe that there will be increased mortality to outmigrating salmon and steelhead as a result. But it seemed as though, considering the conditions in the San Joaquin, which are much worse than in the Sacramento side, that it was an appropriate change to make. The third change dealt with delta outflows. This is probably the most important. This is what I kind of believe is the core standard of D1641. This is what all the focus of the 95 plan and the principles agreement was really around. What type of estuarine protection is needed with respect to outflow in in the delta, and what came out of that whole process was this X2 standard. And the proposal fundamentally is to set aside the X2 standard and to reduce flows needed at the to the flows required to meet salinity control in the delta. For February, that requirement was only one X2 day, and that was already met due to the savings, due to the storm. So it actually didn't cost anything to set aside this core standard for February. It didn't save anything. For chips for March, it looks as though we have 31 days, probably the entire month, we're going to have to meet the X2 standard at chips under the plan. However, there's a provision in the plan that says you can bank X2 days based on meeting them in the previous month in excess of what was required. And so at this point, we expect there'll be 10 to 20 days of X2 at chips, which is either an equivalent of 11,400 CFS or actually being at that X2 position at Chips Island. And that this change, if it stays dry and we don't get another big storm, this is if it stays dry, that we expect that this change could conserve 85 to 170,000 acre-feet of water. This is just for the X2 standard. It doesn't address the 7,100 floor, minimum flow standard that might also not be met if it stays dry, and that would be additional water. So anyway, the temporary urgency change petition requests that this flow be reduced to 4,000 CFS, and I fully expect that these reduced outflow conditions that would result from this, if it stays dry, will have adverse effects on estuarine resources and could be somewhat similar to what occurred last year. I would expect it to be somewhat similar to what occurred last year. So here we're finally getting to the question that I think most people are concerned about, and that is, what are we doing regarding the export provisions? So export restrictions are designed to reduce entrainment at the pumps and to limit the percentage of inflow that can be exported. This type of restriction is meant to limit the impacts of diversions on migratory and estuarine species. D1641 requires a maximum export to inflow ratio of 35% from February through June, with exceptions in February allowed to go up to 45%. And by the way, that exception did go into effect this year. The proposed TCP export limits would comply with the D1641 export to inflow ratio, but would allow for those exports when other delta outflows and delta cross-channel gate closure requirements are not being met. The TCP proposes 3 different export limits, 2 that were included last year and a new tiered limit that wasn't included last year. I won't get basically, the TCP request is that when inflows are below 5,500 or when the delta cross-channel gates are open, exports would be reduced to 1,500. Between 7,100 and 5,500, when the delta cross-channel gate is closed, the export of natural and abandoned flows could be maintained at 3,500 CFS. And for outflows of 7,100 or more, when the X2 is not being met, but there are natural and abandoned flows, that those can be exported pursuant to the regular export limits. So what's different about this proposal relative to 2014 is the assumption that exports above minimum levels should be allowed when minimum outflows of 7,100 CFS are not being met. This is the part of the TCP order that I was not convinced that the proposal would not unreasonably affect fish and wildlife and was in the public interest. As a result, I instead approved a portion of the request, essentially what was approved last year. My approval makes clear that the decision was based on what the information available at the time, and hopefully this workshop can illuminate this issue further. And clearly, reasonable people are going to differ on this issue, but I'll try to run through briefly my reasons. First, the increased exports decrease outflows by the same quantity at a time when outflows are already below minimums. This isn't just a request to increase exports, it's also a request to decrease outflow, which is critically needed. The board has in the past made determinations that flows are a key driver of estuarine resource protection. And by this, I don't mean protection of a couple of species in the estuary. When the previous board decided to set a flow floor, it was based on testimony from myriad stakeholders and scientists, and it addressed all estuarine resources. Things like nutrient cycling, phytoplankton production, zooplankton production, bait fish production, introduced species, water quality, and other factors. Second reason is that higher exports negatively affect hydrodynamics and increase entrainment at a time when flows are already very low. The third reason is that many fish species in the estuary are already at historically low levels and are stressed from multiple years of drought. As I said earlier, delta smelt are at their lowest levels, and I've also talked about longfin and some other. Also, winter run and spring run populations were heavily damaged last year and are now trying to outmigrate. These are just a few of the species that have been impacted by drought over the last 4 years, which lead to low resiliency in the various populations. Fourth, as I guess I'm sort of maybe being repetitive, the remnant population of winter run, all that was left after 95% of the population had already died from heat stress, was in the delta. At the time I signed the TCP, it was estimated that 95% of the population was rearing in the delta, and the latest estimate is still about 95% of the remaining population is rearing in the delta. The fifth reason was that extensive balancing and discussion had occurred in the previous year. That is, last year, the board had workshops on this matter and had adopted an order saying they felt there was a reasonable balance based on what was approved, and so I approved that again and decided at this point that it wouldn't be appropriate in my mind to expand what the board had adopted last year, and instead to bring it to this workshop on the 18th. Anyway, the poor outcomes cited above generally occurred under the operating conditions I approved last year, and they do not support the idea of approving what I perceive to be potentially poorer conditions in the estuary. So the principal argument I've heard to support approval of the request is that the fish agencies determined that operations under the proposed TCP were determined to have no additional adverse effect on the species beyond those previously analyzed. I, on the other hand, had to determine that there's no unreasonable effect on fish and wildlife and other beneficial uses, and that the decision is in the public interest. And these are quite different standards and are broader findings. And the board's flow standards are designed to protect the full range of fish and wildlife resources, and the finding of unreasonable effect applies to this full range of resources. So based on all of those considerations, I disapproved that portion of the export request, that particular tier. So why don't we talk just a minute about what the water supply costs of not approving the tiered exports are. So the theoretical minimum for of water supply costs is 0 acre-feet per day, and that's what happens when flows are somewhat elevated. For example, today there is no cost to this decision. And there likely will not be any cost until about the end of this month under the anticipated flow recession. For the month of February to date, the cost has been 5,100 acre-feet, and that occurred in the first couple of days of the order before the storm hit. And since that storm hit, there haven't been any costs. And you can see what we did here in terms of low estimate and high estimate is we assumed both estimates, they're not really low and high, they're low and high estimates of recession curves under dry conditions. So we have to make an assumption about the slope of the recession curve of the flows if it stays dry. Really, the low estimate would be if we got a couple of more storms, there might not be any cost through the end of March for this particular requirement, or not approving this requirement. It might be nothing more than 5.1 thousand acre feet for the entire 2-month period. But assuming that it stays dry and we don't get any more storms to speak of, I had to make assumptions about, my staff had to make assumptions about the slope of the recession curve. And depending on the slope, it looks like the water supply cost could be 69 to 84,000 acre feet through March under continued dry conditions. And the theoretical maximum cost, if you get to about a flow of, let's say, 9,500 and the flows don't recede anymore and it just sits there, could be as high as 3,200 acre feet a day.
Tom, before you go any further, I just want to, where can people, anyone, get access to this information? Because I think this is at the core of, it goes from reality to hypothesis, and so can people find this information?
Well, I don't think we've posted it, but we will post it in the next day or so if you think that would be helpful.
Because
and certainly we're going to post this PowerPoint, and so that'll be available. But
right.
we'll show the recession curves we're assuming as well, so that people can see what the assumptions are.
And did you work with the projects on this information? Because I know they have modelers that look at this as well.
I know we've talked with them. I don't know. Les and Diane seem to have disappeared. So, but
working on an overflow room.
We've got overflow.
So I think that the projects will be up here later. John Lehigh and maybe Ron, and you can ask them about their opinion of this. I think they probably agree. Certainly, they would agree that with these assumed recession curves, that this is the water supply cost. They might have assumed some other recession curve, but we can certainly bring that to them and have them. And everyone's been citing a cost of 4,000 acre feet a day, and it suddenly occurred to me and my staff that actually, and to DWR, I understand that, well, actually the maximum cost is 3,200 acre feet a day. And it's a little convoluted, so we can explain, I'll explain that at some other time. But that is, I think we've got agreement of everyone that that's the maximum water supply impact at this point. So, I wanted to talk about Sacramento River temperature requirements that are also imposed in the order. Again, this is meant to get to the point of the problem we had with 95% mortality below Shasta. We're asking to do a hindcast of the modeling so that we can try to understand better if we could have done better. I mean, it could have been that there was nothing we could have done, and that would have, and under that circumstance, it would make me feel better, since that would mean that my finding wasn't actually incorrect, since we did the best we could. But if we didn't do the best we could, then we need to understand why we made decisions that was less than the best we could, and how we can improve the modeling so that we can get better estimates next year and not have a repeat of that problem. And so we have some requirements for them to take a look closely at the modeling, and I understand that they're presently working on that. So, again, we have to talk about benefits as well. I mean, I've been talking about the fish concerns, but there are obviously benefits associated with, and I've pointed out some of the water supply costs. The X2 standard, the March, could have some substantial benefits. But, there are benefits to increase. The things that I approved are expected to increase storage upstream. And so when you increase storage upstream, there are multiple benefits to non-consumptive uses. The reservoirs will be a little higher, so there'll be, recreation benefits, fishery benefits, aesthetic benefits. There'll be temperature control downstream and better flow conditions in the downstream areas. And so, a lot of benefits to having a little more flexibility in the upstream reservoirs. There'll also be consumptive use benefits. And so the question is, who benefits from these consumptive uses? And in some cases, it's pretty easy to see who benefits, and in other cases, not so much. But I'll briefly mention, my assumption I make is that the party with the least high priority benefits from increased water being stored upstream, since now if they receive water, they're receiving the benefit of that last increment that occurred. So on New Melones, the party with the lowest priority is clearly Stockton East Water District. And so we haven't seen, the Bureau has not released its Stanislaus River Operations Plan yet, and at least I don't think they have. And if they, when they do, if they're making an allocation at all to Stockton East Water District, that water will be coming out of, in my opinion, the water that we have let be saved up in New Melones by not meeting the fishery standards. If they only make OID and South San Joaquin Irrigation District deliveries, then potentially they're the beneficiary. The other potential beneficiary that isn't mentioned here but should be, apologize, is upstream storage. It could be that they decide that, well, that water should stay in upstream storage in order to carry over into next year and provide more resiliency to the system. But that just means that it's going to be consumptively used in a subsequent year, probably. So for Shasta and for Oroville, I think, again, it's kind of easy to see who the beneficiary is, to the extent that we're making deliveries out of Oroville this summer that's going to the contractors, to the extent that they get to back up additional water, that the State Water Project exporters are the ones who receive the benefit of that. To the extent that they have problems meeting their contractual obligations to their settlement contractors, then they become the beneficiaries. And of course, again, they could elect to keep the water as carryover storage.
I have a question.
Sure.
On CVP exporters and Friant, in situations where there's a zero supply, how are they benefiting?
You're talking about Friant benefiting?
Friant and CVP exporters, you're talking about junior water rights, but in this instance, it must be senior.
Well, the benefits go to the lowest water right priority still receiving water. So if you were to give the exchange contractors nothing, then the last priority, the highest priority water user who receives water receives the benefit of that additional storage.
Who would that be, though, for CVP
Well,
exporters?
settlement contractors, I imagine.
Settlement, oh, okay. So you're talking about Sac Valley. I'm looking at exporters.
Yeah, but potentially if things got bad enough, the water would go to the benefit of the settlement contractors. Somebody's going to consume the water.
But not CVP exporters.
Well, if there is no export water, then clearly they aren't
Right.
benefiting from
Right.
an incremental increase in storage in Shasta. Someone else is.
Exactly. Okay.
And of course, the other thing that's very important, and I think that's overlooked, is that water markets benefit. By firming up the storage in these reservoirs, it means that there is more water overall in the system, and the water markets, don't function very well when things are very, very, are not, when people don't have solid assurances of their water supply. And so to the extent that this firms up some people's water supply, it also firms up the water transfer market, which is very important. And that, like I say, a lot longer than I
And I thank you for going outside your comfort zone.
got to make that I guess I should, and that is that the thing that wasn't approved, the tiered exports, one of the concerns is, well, I showed you the February-March water supply impacts. Mm-hmm. If the decision was to stand, then presumably April and May, the projects would come in with the same requests, so that could cause additional water supply impacts in April and May. I don't think it'll cause any water supply impacts in April and May, and I encourage the project operators to tell me if not, because the biological opinions already have a pretty strict export restriction in April and May that I think would be controlling in any event, unless they choose to loosen that too. I mean, I'm assuming that that biological opinion would stay in effect, but maybe they would change their mind. So when I looked at that, I did think in terms of the biological opinions as well, being in control in April and May. In June, well, if it stays really dry, the outflow standards drops to 4,000 CFS under the Water Quality Control Plan. It stays at 7,100 if it's not really dry. So if it drops to 4,000, then the export restriction doesn't apply anyway, because they're going to meet 4,000 for salinity control. So not clear that there's going to be any water supply after February, water supply effect after February and March. So that might be the total that we're talking about here today, is what you saw. Or it could be more, depending on what decisions are made by the fishery agencies. So next steps. You know, this has attracted a lot of attention, so I do recommend that we staff prepare an order for board consideration in March, and that we also assess and discuss the need for a hearing. And I ask people in the audience to, to also tell us whether or not they think we should be having a hearing or what the focus of that hearing should be. Clearly, we don't want it to be opened up for any purpose.
And people have asked for both a hearing, and some have asked for an evidentiary hearing on all
Right.
sides of the matter. So we'll need to listen carefully today and then turn to you all a bit.
There are also two issues that people talked about in their comment letters that I'd like to make a change. I will be proposing a change in the order, and I can either do that myself, or it can be done in the March order that we bring to the board, depending on the board's preference. In Section 3 of the ordered section, it says that the executive director will determine the use of the saved water. It was my intent that that provision not actually be in the final order, but there were some mix-ups in the last minute as we got this out on a very tight schedule. The reason I don't see any need for it is, as I just described, I think I already know how the water is going to be used, and the point of the approval is to say that it's okay to use that. So I don't see that there's any purpose in making some provision saying the executive director will approve it, since I believe that approval is already in effect by the, by approving the order in general. So I would suggest deleting or amending that section to remove that. Also, in Order Section 1A, we have limited the export limitation relief for transfers to non-SWP CBP licensed right. And that's a pretty narrow category of transfers. And the reason behind that was that we were concerned about the potential export impacts of a large number of transfers. We also didn't think that in February and March there'd be any transfers, so we weren't that concerned about it, or at least I wasn't that concerned about it yet. But I understand that people looking at that would think that this might be what the board does in subsequent months, and that therefore it would hinder the transfer market. So I suggest that we amend that requirement, but quite honestly, at this point, I don't know exactly how to amend it. I would like to make that exemption for relief broader, and but how exactly to do that, I'm not sure. One option, of course, is to do what we did last year, which just says all transfers are okay, and export limitations don't apply to those transfers. And so I'm interested in comments from the parties, and also try to figure out what we could recommend regarding that issue. And
we'll come back to that then after we hear from everyone.
Right. And that's it. I'm sorry it was so long.
Well, I know it's hard for you. I do appreciate you explaining the thinking, because I do think there's been a fair amount of misunderstanding, and so I think a fuller explanation is actually helpful. I know we have some questions, but before we do, I want to thank Senator Nielsen for joining us and for agreeing to stay through the presentation. Glad you heard part of it. I also indicated earlier some of your colleagues who were able to come but then had to leave, that staff, since we can't, staff would be happy to come brief them on the totality of what was intended, and we make that offer to you on anything that would be helpful to you. So with that, please join us. Yeah, absolutely. Pleased to have you here.
Well, Chairwoman Marcus and members of the
Oh, make sure it's on.
Yeah.
timer. Yes. Chairwoman Marcus and board members, thank you for the indulgence. It's a pleasure being here, and I'm glad I got to listen to the presentation thus far. Driving down today, I was thinking of their name, the Water Resources Control Board, musing on my life as a farmer, the east and west side of the San Joaquin Valley, the Sacramento Valley, and a representative of the North and Central Delta and the Sacramento River and its watershed. And your operative word is control. And the challenge, in my experience, is you never so much control water as get along with it as best you can. And that's what you're commendably doing here today. I have a couple of messages that I want to deliver, and I'm glad that I'm here with a lot of representatives of the Sacramento area, region, and a lot of farm workers and farmers here today. You know, they have a big stake in the heavy burdens and decisions that you make. I do want to reference the Director's Temporary Urgency Change Petition and the letter that was submitted by the City of Roseville. This is getting to be an annual presentation. I hope the weather cooperates so we don't have to do it every year. I'd like to come for other reasons. But the temporary change petition that the Bureau of Reclamation and the Water Resources proposed, we consider to be well balanced and prudent under all circumstances. We don't know what the future conditions are going to be. We were fortunate with a good January and a challenged February. It may be resolved with a storm coming in the end of the week, but it doesn't sound too serious of a storm, so we still have many challenges. The order strikes what I call an appropriate balance between protecting upstream storage and delta water quality. Importantly, the storage in the upstream reservoirs will help avoid the disaster circumstances we've heretofore had. I've been taking careful note of the levels in Shasta and Oroville, and at least it's encouraging at this point compared to where we were last year. But the dry down of Folsom could leave 500,000 citizens without water. There are many communities around California that have been affected by this drought, but this is a concentration of very substantial numbers that would very substantially cause harm. We ask you to continue to take appropriate actions, working with the Bureau of Reclamation, Department of Water Resources, to operate the projects in a manner that accommodates to the maximum everybody's interests. And I know that that's what you've tried to do with the temporary order. And I thank you for your past support for that temporary order, and I'm delighted to hear how it was so well presented here today. I also want to make note that, and I think I see evidence of it in the presentation here today, it's important to Roseville and part of Folsom and the San Joaquin Water District to have clear projections of there'll need to be pulse flows and what additional needs may be required in flows in the Delta. And that we must do everything we can to ensure that we do take care of the needs of all parties. But those parties do include agriculture, they do include human use, as well as the environmental uses that are so important. It appears that you may be revising the temporary order or considering it again and having another presentation in April. Would that to be the case, I certainly would appreciate the opportunity to appear before you at that time. It's very clear to me the nature of the presentation here today, and sir, I forget your name. Okay, we've met in my office many times, and I certainly admire your expertise. The board's lucky to have good people like this appearing before you. I have confidence that together we can work this out. And understand when I use the word we, I believe that that is a responsibility of the governor, the responsibility of the legislature, as well as you and other departments of state and federal government. I'm here to pledge my support, working with you towards these ends, and I appreciate your consideration of this temporary order and keeping in mind the citizens of the Sacramento region, Roseville, Folsom, and these farm workers and farmers that are out here, folks. They're very real to me. I've worked with them in the fields. It's a challenge. Thank you for your responsible actions. Thank you for allowing me a moment to speak with you today.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for always having an open door for us. We really do appreciate it, and you spending all this time. I have a logistical question. I feel bad about the folks standing there. We were looking for an overflow room. Yeah, unfortunately, our room, which is a big room, is under construction, which is why we're in here in the first place. But did you find something?
Yes, Sierra is being set up now. Should be done in about 10 minutes. So we're going to set that up so that we will also have audio visual
So
of what's
people
going
can
on here.
see.
That's correct.
Terrific. So then they can come in to give cards to Ms. Townsend and then watch from there, and I'll try and do names in advance. So then the question is, you had said earlier you thought we needed a break because you needed to go set up, or can we keep going? I mean, I also, there's a human dimension of bio breaks at some point during the morning that I like to honor, and we'll probably take a very short lunch break. We do need to take some sort of a lunch break, just blood sugar and other things, and being able to really pay attention to everyone. Yes, sir.
And I was going to say, if you could raise your hand if you have an empty seat. There's a few empty seats.
Yeah, there are a few empty seats in the front.
So folks in the back, come on down.
If I could make one suggestion.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, because we do have about 200 people here that we brought in from the Central Valley. And I know that the way you're structured right now relative to panels, it's going to be a very lengthy session.
Yes.
The challenge that we have is that we really need to be able to take. Oh, I'm
Let's get a
sorry.
little closer
Yeah,
to it.
our challenge is that we're probably going to have to leave Sacramento around 3 o'clock in order to get people back to the Central Valley. So if there's a way that you might consider at some point letting some public input be brought in, because if we have to wait for all the panels, it'll be too late for these folks to provide that
Right.
input. So if you would consider that, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I talked about that earlier, I think, before you all arrived. I'll try and save a little time. I can't have 200
Oh, no.
comments by any means, just because we do have
Correct.
folks that signed up for panels. But I'm going to try and take a little time before lunch, maybe 20, 30 minutes
That would be perfect.
for public, and so people do need to get their cards in, but I can't do 200. 'cause
No,
we have the
we're just
panel.
looking for a little opportunity for some folks to be able to say a few words.
Excellent.
Okay?
That's great, yeah. No, we definitely want to hear from you. We noted that problem when we saw how many hours of panel testimony we have. Part of the interesting, hopefully we will get through at least most of it by 3, is the value of listening to the panels, as you will hear the varying different views, which we have to take into consideration between the varying parties dealing with this issue, which does pertain to water rights. So hopefully we'll get through enough of that by 3 that also all the folks you brought get a chance to also hear from the full range of other participants, so they can get a feel for what is happening here.
Completely understand.
Yeah.
But if you do accommodate something, noonish time for about 30 minutes, that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Definitely. Yes, ma'am. Fantastic. Okay, the Sierra room is 2 rooms down. If you go down to the edge of the wall and turn right, the entrance to the room is a little bit towards the back wall. So you pass the coastal room and then turn right. And Barbara will lead the way, who is the head of our water rights division. Yeah, those who are standing need to go to the Sierra room. It's a fire marshal rule. My apologies. And the fire marshal is Elvis is in the building? Yes, he is. The fire marshal is in the building. So.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yeah.
The San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority and State Water Contractors requested to present as a panel.
Yeah.
And we're happy to accommodate those that have come from the Central Valley. And are very willing to present later in the day if that would help you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. There are a couple of asked to speak right after, and it may work out fine, but we'll have a lot of questions. Do people have questions for Mr. Howard now? He's going to be here all day, so I'm inclined to move on with the presentations. I have some questions, but they may be illuminated. We'll be asking you questions throughout, if that's all right. Is that all right? Just so that we can keep moving. Now, I also note that I think next, and tell me if I'm wrong, Les, there are sort of 2 sets of presentations from the petitioners, the projects, but we wanted to start with a policy level presentation from Mr. Cowan, Mr. Areve? Yeah, you got to tell me. I got to get it right. I never say it. I just see you all the time. Areve? All right, sorry, you're going to have to say it several times so we get it right. I have a thing about trying to get people's names right. So with that, Please. And then we probably will take a very brief break, just a quick bio break, only 5 minutes, I know. And I really mean 5 minutes when I say 5 minutes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Mark Cowan, Director of the Department of Water Resources. If you don't mind, I'll speak from this mic. I'm a bit vertically challenged for your podium. Anyway,
That's right.
thank
We
you.
need to get a booster for the speaker when someone is, for the thing when someone as tall as you.
I thought that'd be better than kneeling before you.
Yeah. Well, I think that's just fine. That's just fine.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for holding this important workshop today. I think we will hear a lot of important information that we all should consider closely. It looks like it's going to be another tragically beautiful day in California, assuming the fog lifts today. And what that means to me is that drought is going to continue, as is our difficult job of managing limited water supplies under these circumstances. And we will all hear from a lot of different people and their perspectives on the effects of drought this year to cities, farms, fish and wildlife, and especially the communities that are dependent upon our farm economy. I don't think there's any significant dispute about the magnitude and the significance of the effects of drought in any quarter. And I also believe that every drop of water, every acre foot of water takes on, of course, heightened significance in this type of circumstance. But I will agree for the most part with Tom's characterization of the water supply impacts that are in play today. Our technical panel will go into more detail on this, but all that to say, I don't think any outcome of this workshop is going to fundamentally change the magnitude or the distribution of effects of this drought. On the other hand, I think this workshop is especially important for the conversation we're going to have about how we frame these issues, how we make decisions about competing needs under these circumstances, and that's why I'm here today. That's the substance of what I want to briefly talk to you about. Of course, my comments will be focused on the portion of the temporary urgency change petition that Tom did not approve. Let me say up front, I appreciate the portions that he did approve. They're going to be important to help us manage water this year, but of course...
Thank you, Mark. People have a tendency to forget all the things that Tom Howard says yes to.
Yes, I agree. There's many ways to characterize all of this, so still this last provision of our temporary urgency change petition is important to us, and I want to speak to that today. You've already heard a short description of what that request is, so I won't elaborate. I'll leave that to our technical panels. But to be clear, this is about additional flexibility that we're seeking to export additional amounts of natural and abandoned flows in the Delta. So let me just make a few points that I hope might help clarify and frame the issues that are before us. We already heard from Bill Croyle about water supply situation. Let me just quickly put a fine point on that. Bill has a very sobering assessment of where we stand this year. I have heard in my conversations that there is some consideration that because the State Water Project is at a 15% allocation this year relative to our final allocation of 10% last year, that's an indication that we're in better shape this year than we were last year. I want to firmly oppose that suggestion. The State Water Project allocation is not a good bellwether of the entire state water picture. Just for example, last year State Water Project customers also took delivery of about 384,000 acre-feet of water that they'd carried over from 2013 and previous years. That translates to about a 9% allocation on State Water Project contracts. So consider that as an addition to the 10% of normal allocation in 2014 we delivered. So strictly speaking, on a State Water Project allocation picture alone, we are in no better condition than we were last year. In addition to that, local supplies are more depleted now than they were last year. The local reservoirs in Metropolitan Water District of Southern California system, those terminal reservoirs are about 1.1 million acre feet of water lower this year than they were at this time last year. We all know about groundwater extraction and the records amounts of groundwater that are extracted from the Central Valley last year. We can expect that to continue. We can expect more wells to go dry this year. So let me just underscore what I think you all got from Bill Croyle's presentation. We are far from out of the woods. In fact, we are entering the 4th year of a very significant drought in California's history. A second point I want to make, just to make sure we don't conflate a couple of important issues. This request regarding the tiered exports that Tom has already described to you all is about our ability to export water that appears in the Delta that we are unable to store in upstream reservoirs. So we shouldn't conflate cold water management or upstream storage considerations with this provision of this temporary urgency change petition. Separate issues, both important, but what we are requesting here is more flexibility to export waters that appear in the Delta as natural or abandoned flows. So I think that's extremely important. One other consideration, I want to clarify that what DWR and Reclamation are looking for here is additional regulatory flexibility.